I'm standing at the junction of Willow Road and Willowburn Road in Kirkwall, and below me you can see the Willowburn meandering down towards the trees in the distance. The Willowburn starts its life about a mile to the east of here at the head of the Pabdale Valley, and for much of its length the burn is culverted, but here at the junction of the roads it emerges into one of Kirkwall's most popular amenity areas. It hasn't always been so manicured. Just behind was the ducky pond. This was the mill pond holding water for the mill, which stands 150 metres away through the trees. The mill is no longer in operation, and Pabdale School stands where the ducky pond was. But when they were both working, it's likely that the habitats in the area were different. Currently we have a fine example of plantation woodland, lots of sycamores and a few wych elms, but before the arrival of the trees, it's likely that there was extensive wetland habitat and wild woodland or dales vegetation. But frustratingly, there are very few biological records for this area. We don't really know when the trees were planted, we don't know when the ducky pond was drained, we don't know when the course of the burn was altered. We don't know if the burn was lined with yellow iris or the banks were covered in willows. We don't know when the rooks first started to nest. If only someone had made notes and kept records. All we can use as reference are a couple of photos taken by Tom Kent around 1920. In the first we can see the ducky pond in the foreground. I think I can make out yellow iris along the front margin, but that's about it. There also seems to be a group of fairly substantial trees just beyond the pond, more so than there are nowadays. Note also that there are no houses in White Street, and the open area across to the East Kirk are allotments. In the second photograph we can see the upper bridge crossing the burn, and the sycamore trees on the left are not dissimilar to those that we see today. And to the right, look at all those trees, far more in 1920 than there are nowadays. What makes it all even harder to understand is the information that we find on the memorial stone near the mill. 600 trees were planted in 1935 and 600 more in 1937. So that's 1,200 trees, but where are they? There are only 150 trees in the woodland now. There would be none of this head scratching if just a few notes and just a few records had been made and archived. Anyway, I think it's time to walk along the side of the burn to see if we can find any clues that indicate the former habitats, and after that we'll look at the variety of species that can be found in a typical Orkney plantation woodland. As I walk along the side of the burn, there are few indications of what the habitat used to be like, but every so often you come across a little clue, and here on the right hand side of the burn you can see the leaves of meadowsweet. It's likely that in bygone times much of the burn was lined with meadowsweet, but this is all we have now. And another wetland plant is the lady's smock or cuckoo flower. And here, just at the bend on the burn, is the best example of what the willow burn might have been like many years ago. We have a splendid tea-leafed willow with its shiny glossy leaves, and just to the left of it, down on the edge of the water, there are the spear-shaped leaves of the yellow iris, also known as yellow flag and flag iris. And even better, just beyond the bend in the burn we have marsh marigolds, and to the right of them are more spear-shaped leaves of the yellow iris. We've seen just a handful of plants that are associated with freshwater wetland habitat: meadowsweet, lady's smock, marsh marigold and yellow iris, but there's not a lot here. It's essentially a manicured area of creeping buttercup and broadleaf dock. I can imagine that in times past there were thick stands of meadowsweet and yellow iris lining the burn, And there were carpets of marsh marigolds, lady smock and even orchids in the damp, low-lying areas. But we have no records, so we'll never know. Let's look at the woodland now. Another thing that has always puzzled me is why this area is called the Willows. Maybe it's simply a direct reference to what was here in the past, but they are certainly not here now. There is just one willow, the tea-leaf willow, which we have just looked at on the bend in the burn. Of the rest of the trees, and there are 150 of them, the vast majority, just over 100, are sycamores. The remaining trees include 32 wych elms and small numbers of ash, rowan, hazel and white beam. And we can see some of that variety here. In the foreground we have the tea-leafed willow. Behind we can see the common white beam. To the left of that a sycamore, and to the left of that one of the wood's finest examples of wych elm. Here's a convenient comparison. We have sycamore on the right and wych elm on the left. The sycamore, which is also known as the Scots plane, is Orkney's commonest tree. It's extremely hardy and obviously finds the county to its liking. But it's not a native. The forests of Central Europe are where it thrives, and it was brought from there to Britain in the Middle Ages. The wych elm, or Scots elm, being salt and wind resistant, appears happy in Orkney conditions. It's Britain's only native elm species and is by far the most common elm in the north and west of the British Isles. And while we are here, let's look at this fine tree, a common white beam. Now the usual white beam we find in Orkney is the Swedish white beam, which has rounded lobes on its leaves. Much less frequent is the common white beam. It has oval leaves with fine teeth and no lobes. The ground flora in the willows is fairly limited. With frequent grass cutting and even more frequent root droppings, the ground is going to favour plants that prosper on a nutrient-enriched soil. Consequently, we have a ground cover that has lots of creeping buttercup and broad-leaved dock. But here and there, other nutrient-tolerant plants prosper. The willows is good for snowdrops, daffodils and bluebells. The bluebell is in fact the hybrid bluebell, a mix of the native bluebell, which just has a toehold in Caithness, but not in Orkney, and the Spanish bluebell. It appears to be a recent addition to Orkney, since the county's earlier botanists make no mention of it. Another example of if only they'd taken notes. And here we are in a meadow of pink purslane. This is another plant that thrives in these nutrient-rich conditions. It can be pink, white or purple. 250 years ago, this plant was unknown in Britain. The belief is that it arrived at some time in the late 18th century, having hitched a lift with bales of cotton from North America. The bales were bound for the Lancashire cotton mills. Not long after, pink purslane was flowering in Manchester, and since then has colonised a large part of Britain. No doubt it took a while to reach Orkney, but Magnus Spence, Orkney's great botanist, in 1914 indicates that it is now found in plantations, Binscarth and elsewhere, which is not as informative as it could be. Was elsewhere here, in the willows? During March and April, before the buttercups and docks appear, the ground cover of the willows is dominated by the lesser celandine. By mid-May, however, the flowers have wilted and the leaves have yellowed and will soon disappear completely. Now here's a good example of what we should be doing. recording species and recording change. I live nearby and come here frequently, but no matter how many times you go somewhere, you always see something new. This plant is new for the willows. Well, it's new for me. I think it's a plant called fringe cups, which goes by the splendid Latin name Thelema grandiflora, and it's a record that I'll certainly be sending into the local record centre. And what essential information do we need to send? Species, location and date, and then of course a few notes if necessary. Ferns are typical of woodland, and here in the willows we can find 3 species. Their presence, however, creates a couple of questions. Are they part of the wild woodland vegetation that may have existed in previous centuries, or have they arrived from the nearby gardens in Willow Road? Many of the houses in Willow Road were built in the late Victorian and Edwardian years. Growing ferns was popular in that era, and they still grow in many nearby gardens. This may account for the large number of male and lady ferns, but I like to think that the broad buckler fern is a legacy of the wild wood or dale. We are in Papdale, which surely indicates that there were woodland plants such as ferns, foxgloves, willows, wild roses and honeysuckle. During this wee film, the sound of calling rooks has never ceased. It's mid-May and the height of the breeding season, with parents feeding youngsters and the young ones just beginning to leave the nests. At the end of February, nest building began, and the piles of twigs and branches were easy to see in the leafless trees. Now the nests are harder to see as the trees fill out. The woodland is very much rook territory, but we know little of their history. We do know that rooks first nested in Orkney in 1876. That was at Muddisdale, but we don't know when they first began to nest in the willows. All I can tell you is that there were 229 nests in 2010 and 250 nests in 2020. And no wonder there is this constant noise. 250 nests with 3 chicks equals 750 chicks, plus 2 adults at each nest equals 500 adults, giving us a grand total of 1,250 birds. That's 750 ever open mouths to feed. The 500 adults have their work cut out. No wonder there is ever-present noise. Apart from the rooks, the only other birds that nest in the trees are wood pigeons and collared doves. However, the woodland is used by other species that breed nearby as a place to forage for food. Currently you can see starlings, wrens and blackbirds doing just that. And if you are lucky or have the patience, you may catch sight of a pair of grey wagtails that breed along the burn in most years. With their grey backs and sulphur yellow fronts, they add a distinctive splash of colour to the willows. The trees in the willows know no rest. Even when the nesting season is over, the rooks remain faithful to the site. It becomes their roost. Their numbers are swollen by rooks and jackdaws from elsewhere in Orkney and maybe further afield. Hundreds of birds congregate at night in the tops of the trees before heading off to scour the fields for food once the day has broken. My favourite time is later in the year, when the trees are bare and the rooks are away in the fields. It's then that the woodland is silent, except for 2 or 3 robins singing their melancholy autumn song. We've asked a fair few questions in this film and haven't come up with too many answers. Records build a picture and we haven't got too many of those. It would be valuable to know what the area was like in times past so that we can see what has been gained and what has been lost. This sort of information helps greatly in influencing decision making. For instance, it might be that a change in council policy means less grass cutting in the Willows. What effect could that have? Obviously, less grass cutting means less enriched soil and finer plants could make a comeback. But less grass cutting could mean that more rank vegetation could develop. But if we knew which plants had been here, then recommendations could be made for targeted grass cutting and the removal of those cuttings. A heavy cut in May may provide space for cuckoo flower, meadowsweet and even orchids to re-emerge. One piece of the jigsaw materialised while I was out walking the dog last week. In the Willows we found very few indications of a previous wetland habitat. But here, rather unexpectedly, in a garden in Willowburn Road, I saw this lawn. It's an unimproved lawn and hasn't been subjected to fertilisers. In effect, it's a wet meadow with lady's smock and fine grasses. We are standing about 100 metres from the burn, and maybe this last remnant of wet meadow is a tiny fragment of what there was here before the houses and before the willows.